Hello guys, this is Danilo, and together with my friend Arwin, we are going to talk about U.S. Economic Imperialism. Before jumping on to what is U.S. Economic Imperialism, let us talk about what is imperialism. Imperialism is about extending power or dominion, done by colonizing other colonies for 1. Political purposes. Powerful countries govern other colonies to either gain some new allies or train some new military troops. 2. Social purposes. The main purpose of colonizing other colonies is to either spread language or religion. 3. Economic purposes. Imperial powers often compete with each other for the best potential resources, markets, and trade. After knowing the meaning of imperialism, let us go back to our topic, U.S. Economic Imperialism. Just a quick overview. This topic is all about how the United States take control on some countries known today as a U.S. territory, and also how the Latin American countries develop its own economy with the aid of the United States after gaining its independence from Spain. After the Latin American countries gained its independence from colonial domination between the late 18th and the mid-19th centuries, the new nations of Latin America still face a struggle for economic and political recovery. Before and after independence, most Latin Americans would still work for their landowners. Since the wages were too low and the prices were too high, these workers went into debt, and this accumulated from one generation to the other. On the other hand, the landowners only got wealthier after the independence. This is because most new Latin American governments took over the lands of the native people and would sell these lands too high that only the wealthy people could afford. Political instability was also a widespread problem during the 19th century. This is because of caudillos. Yeah, caudillos. These were military dictators who were once military leaders who struggled to gain the independence of Latin American countries. They were able to hold onto power because they were backed up by the military. And by the mid-1800s, mostly all Latin American countries were governed by caudillos. There were some exceptions, however, just like Argentina's Domingo Sarmiento, who has a strong commitment in improving education. And during his rule between 1868 and 1874, the number of students in Argentina doubled. The caudillos also faced some oppositions, because they sided more onto the wealthy landowners than to the lower classes. The landowners also support the caudillos, because both groups does not want lower classes to gain one thing, and that's power. Actually, the dependency of these Latin American countries also has a positive effect, because they are free in, trading. With the discovery of new technology, the invention of new machines, the exports grew. One main reason is the development of transportation, such as railroads and steamships, which widens the area of where they can trade. And also the discovery of refrigeration, which increases the variety of the goods and products they can trade. The sad thing is, they only depend on their exports. And only the foreign countries benefited in the increased trade more than the Latin Americans did. Instead of using their export income in building roads, schools, and hospitals, they often borrowed money at high interest rates to develop facilities for the export industries from countries such as Britain, France, United States, and Germany. Unfortunately, the Latin American countries often were unable to pay back their loans. In response, the foreign lenders sometimes threatened them to collect the debt by force. At other times, they threatened to take over the facilities they had funded, resulting to the inability for the Latin Americans to take control on their own industries.
A Latin American empire. Long before the United States had any economic interest in Latin American countries, it realized that it had strong links with its southern neighbors. Leaders of the United States were well aware that their country's security depended on the security of Latin America. By the early 1800s, most Latin American colonies had gained their independence, but they were insecure. They feared that European countries would try to colonize them again. The United States, a young nation itself, feared this too. So in 1823, President James Monroe issued what came to be called the Monroe Doctrine. The doctrine warns European nations that the United States would not tolerate further colonization or puppet monarchs. The doctrine was conceived to meet major concerns of the moment, but it soon became a watchword of U.S. policy in the Western Hemisphere. Until 1898, the United States did little to enforce the Monroe Doctrine. Cuba provided a real testing ground. The Caribbean island of Cuba was one of Spain's last colonies in the Americas. In 1868, Cuba declared its independence and fought a 10-year war against Spain. In 1878, with the islands in ruins, the Cubans gave up the fight, but some Cubans continued to seek independence from Spain. One of the heroes who fought for Cuban independence was Jose Marti. Jose Marti was only 15 in 1868 when he first began speaking out for Cuban independence. In 1871, the Spanish colonial government punished Marti's open opposition with exile. Except for a brief return to his homeland in 1878, Marti remained in exile for about 20 years. For most of this time, he lived in New York City. There he continued his career as a writer and a revolutionary. After Jose Marti's exile in 1895, he returned to launch a second war for Cuban independence. Marti was killed early in the fighting, but the Cubans battled on. By the mid-1890s, the United States had developed substantial businesses holdings in Cuba. Therefore, it had an economic stake in the fate of the country. But when the Spanish had forced many Cuban civilians into concentration camps, Americans objected to the Spanish brutality. In 1898, the United States joined the Cuban War for Independence. This conflict, which became known as the Spanish-American War. The war lasted about 4 months. The U.S. forces launched their first attack on the Philippine Islands, a Spanish colony thousands of miles away in the Pacific. Unprepared for a war on two fronts, the Spanish military quickly collapsed. Cuba and United States won the war, and United States became Cuba's protectorate. In 1901, Cuba became an independent nation. However, the United States installed a military government and continued to exert control over Cuban affairs. This caused tremendous resentment among many Cubans, and the relationship between both countries have been broken. When Spain was defeated in the war, Spain turned over the last of its colonies to the U.S., having become the dominant imperial power in Latin America. Latin Americans were beginning to regard the United States as the political and economic colossus of the North. A colossus is a huge statue that towers over the surrounding area. The United States was a colossus in geographic terms too. By the 1870s, the Transcontinental Railroad connected its east and west coasts. But during the time, land travel and sea travel would take too long. This led to the creation of a canal. If a canal could be dug across a narrow section of Central America, the United States had been thinking about such a project since the early 19th century. In the 1880s, a French company tried but failed to build a canal across Panama. Despite this failure, Americans remained enthusiastic about the canal, and no one was more enthusiastic than President Theodore Roosevelt. In 1903, Panama was a province of Colombia. Roosevelt offered that country $10 million plus a yearly payment for the right to build a canal. When the Colombian government demanded more money, the United States responded by encouraging a revolution in Panama. In 1903, with the help from the United States Navy, they won their country's independence. In gratitude, Panama gave the United States a 10-mile wide zone in which to build a canal. For the next decade, American engineers contended with floods and withering heat to build a massive waterway. However, their greatest challenge was the disease-carrying insects that infested the area. The United States began a campaign to destroy the mosquitoes that carried yellow fever and malaria, and the rats that carried bubonic plague. The effort to control these diseases was eventually successful. Even so, thousands of workers died during construction of the canal. The Panama Canal finally opened in 1914. Ships from around the world soon began to use it. Latin America had become a crossroads of world trade, and the United States controlled the toll gate. The Panama Canal is considered one of the world's greatest engineering accomplishments. Its completion changed the course of history by opening a worldwide trade route between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. The building of the Panama Canal was only one way that the United States expanded its influence in Latin America in the early 20th century. Its presence in Cuba and its large investments in many Central and South American countries strengthened its foothold. To protect those economic interests, in 1904, President Roosevelt issued a corollary or extension to the Monroe Doctrine. The Roosevelt Corollary gave the United States the right to be an international police power in the Western Hemisphere. That is the end of our report.